Hi there. Welcome to Storytime. I am Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar, and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible, in particular when they do so uncritically. They apply it to their lives uncritically. I just realized I took something out of the props for my microphone, and it's a little too low. So sorry about that. Okay, hi. So I am back to do some more work talking about sin, specifically related to what the Bible does and does not say about it, because I'm a biblical scholar, and that's where I like to stay, is to talk about biblical texts. So one of the things so before we jump into things, so thank you for being here. I am a public biblical scholar, so independent biblical scholar, however you want to look at that. So I appreciate any of you who are interested in being here live with me and are able to be. I appreciate all the comments and likes. I appreciate when you subscribe to my channel. And as the end of that intro indicated, I did not put patrons in my intro. I need to put patrons in my intro. I'm grateful for all the ways that people support me, including financially through my Patreon, which is at Biblical Bird, if you're interested in supporting me. But today is 4th of July, which is a big deal in the United States. And I almost didn't come live because it's a holiday for a lot of people, but I thought I'm still working. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a live stream today and hope that some folks show up or watch what we end up doing today. So last week I did a response to one of Gavin Ortland's videos, and that was a lot of work for me emotionally, and I wanted to be as respectful as possible about it all, and so it was a lot of time ahead of time for me, and I'm not sure that I'll be doing that very often. And at the same time, there's a part of me that feels like maybe I should be. So I don't know if there's any kind of feedback on that, whether that was actually useful for people who typically watch what I do. Is there a desire or a need or an interest in more of that? I would love to hear some feedback on that. If you have some thoughts about it from last week's stream, it has gotten a lot of views, so that makes me think there is an interest in it. But I also don't know if getting a lot of views was just, more of the, car accident, wanting to see what's going on versus actually really finding it useful. So I'm interested in doing things that are productive and helpful for people, and working to do that and maintain my sanity, right? So any comments to those effect would be welcome. And I finally wrapped up. I got to do an Ask Me Anything through biblical on Reddit. That was kind of fun. There were some really interesting questions over there that I got to engage. So anyway, things with my book. I'm still working on the audio for my book. That's coming along. I'm very pleased with it, and it should be out by the next Diablo Critics, I'm hoping. So we'll see about that. So good things happening here. And so what I'm doing today is I want to look at some more biblical passages with you. The first round was, I think, a month ago, actually, talking about what is sin. Let's talk about sin. And what, as with every other topic that people want to turn to the Bible to talk about, to get some input on, the topic of sin is varied, highly varied in terms of what did people mean. Did they even have the concept? Like, when did the concept show up in the stories, or in what way did they talk about this idea of sin that we have? And the first time, the first, part one, I asked you all who were able to be here live what you think of as the definition, like what is sin to you? And I'm going to go back and read a couple of those because they were fascinating. You all gave me some really fascinating definitions, or the working definitions perhaps that maybe you had when you were previously, that maybe you don't really it's not a thing that affects you now, but that's how you thought about it maybe in the past. Some of you made those kinds of comments. I'm going to read some of your definitions. So I asked you all, what was what do you think sin is? And it's one of the comments. I was happy when I figured out that, quote, original sin was nothing more than a playground bully claiming I had spiritual cooties, which I think is an interesting summation of original sin. Spiritual cooties got some good laughs. Disobeying God. I mean, I think that's actually, in a sense, that's what most people think sin is. And so what does that mean? How do we know we're disobeying God? Have you ever stopped to think about that framework in terms of how very anthropomorphic that is? So, meaning God is being described in a very human-like form that we are relating to like a human, right? So one of the long-term projects I have, right, is this thing about redefining God. And primarily because I just don't think that the way that God is talked about today is very useful or productive. And that's what makes a lot of people just leave religion or end up being very almost many people I see be somewhat dismissive and disrespectful to the realm of what faith communities can do and do for people. So, one of the reasons I try to avoid talking about sin, and therefore realized I probably just needed to do some sessions on it, is because of how intimately tied it is. This idea of sin is to a very specific way of thinking and talking about God, right? So sin, um, there's just so many great definitions. It's a made up construct that the majority of people think is dichotomous, yes and no, right, wrong, transgression of the law. Sin is separation. That's an interesting definition, tapping into, right, we separate ourselves from God because of this. Like, it's really a fascinating realm of thought. You can see how development over centuries can take on lots of elements here. A made up concept to convince people that they can't be good on their own. It's a really interesting suggestion there, right? But with the help of a particular preacher, I think I read this one out loud last time because I thought it was so funny. Preaching a particular God in $29.95, they can have eternal life. Sin is norm taboos. Yeah. Used to structure power and in-group, out-group dynamics. I think that one, Aaron Colson's, was really quite succinct and spot on. Disobedience to God's commands. So this is the thing that most people circle back to. A couple people commented in the people offering their definitions to, there's this thing that we see people talk about in the biblical context of you've done something wrong that you need. What was the language? Something about people. Let's see. Oh, shoot. Sorry. It was a great little summary of, we need to make a distinction between moral failings and this metaphysical concept of impurity that can be cleansed with cow blood, something like that. It was very nicely said. Another definition of sin is whatever the religious power structures deem it to be. The given reasons are generally excuses, apologetics, or are not even named. I'm adding that to what this person said. The proposition that there are certain things that a deity disapproves of or dislikes. I mean, there's some really, I think these are getting at, right? Biblically speaking, at least, when we see this idea being talked about, this is most of what it is. This is such an interesting one. I think sin was originally a way of explaining actions Yahweh would punish by causing their crops to fail or enemy nations to succeed against the Hebrew people. I think that's also an element of it, especially in the Hebrew Bible. Christians disagree with each other about what it is, just like everything else. Yes, that's true. So here's the one. Theists always fail to make the connection between, not the distinction, metaphysical contamination that can be cleaned with cow blood and moral failing. So there are a couple pieces to this that I want to highlight before we go look at biblical passages together. One is the Bible itself is a pretty terrible resource for ethics and morality. But most people think that it is a resource for ethics and morality, right? Or most people within religious communities are taught to think of it that way, right? It's a guidebook for life, basic instructions before leaving Earth, or it's a holy text that teaches us how to be good, right? And like, actually, no, that isn't what it does. Actually, you have to pick and choose passages and selectively, and also have to trust your own intuition at times because the Bible is so complex and complicated in terms of the messages it sends. So to me, biblical anything, right? An honest assessment of biblical anything, biblical sexual ethics, biblical morality, biblical marriage, biblical whatever relationships. Several people asked me about, Ask Me Anything on Reddit, which relationship in the Bible, which marriage or relationship in the Bible do I think is the healthiest or the best? I'm like, I don't think any of them are. I'm not just trying to get out of answering your question. It's important to me to state that I don't think any of them are, not as they're depicted, right? So the two big things here from my perspective is the way, as I said before, the way that the concept of sin is tied to a very specific way of talking about God, and it is a very human projection onto the realm of the divine, okay? And so that there is the possibility to offend the God, right? That's a very common ancient belief. I'm not challenging that billions of people on the planet have thought that, over the centuries, over the millennia. I'm not challenging that part of human experience, but I am challenging that we continue to uphold it, right? So the primary way that sin is talked about is in this framework of disobedience, or in this framework of upholding some rules and laws. And what was so profound for me in seminary, yes, in seminary, not in graduate school, not when I was doing PhD work, but in seminary, was when someone showed me a way to talk about sin beyond individual mistakes or individual failings or moral failings or whatever you want to say, but to talk about structures, oppressive powers, and systems as being sinful. Because that then changed the whole game for me. It took me a while, to be honest, right? It took me a while as my evangelical self to wrap my head around something other than individual failings, disobedience, whatever, to get over to a more social justice informed lens, right? So that sin is, systems at work that are harmful. It is people who are working together for something that is harmful, that is oppressive in some way. It is exploitative. It is something that is not just. That to me, it takes it out of the realm of you and God, or us people and God, and it turns it into a realm of what are we doing with each other, right? And that is something that is productive in my mind, because then it makes it about us, our responsibility, our needing to take responsibility, being held accountable in ways that are meaningful, versus you're just going to burn it. You're not going to get to go flap your wings in heaven for all eternity. Like, the way heaven is talked about does not appeal to me at all. You know what I mean? So that's why I do avoid talking about sin, because you have to take the whole system. You have to, in my opinion, you need to be able to look at the whole framework, the whole theological framework. And that is a very difficult thing to do well in 30 minutes or an hour, much less, or even in 3, because I'm probably going to do a third part of talking about sin in a week or two. And it's still not gonna, like, it's still hard to do, right? So, but what I see you all on the first part, what I saw many of you all talking about, many of those who were able to be there, who chimed in, who felt like chiming in, and I realized there were people there who didn't, and that's, but the people who did, like, I see that you're thinking about the issue of power and control in a community, and I think that is a helpful place to offer some critique in terms of what these biblical texts have been used to do. Um, yeah, and so then the other piece is, okay, the way this concept of sin is talked about in the Hebrew Bible as well as in the Newer Testament, and its connection to a very particular way of talking about God. And then this other bit about ethics and morality, right? That I don't think the Bible is good at addressing, but we act like it is. And when you take ethics and morality to social systems or structures and powers and the way things are set up and run, that is very, very productive and useful in my mind. But that isn't really usually how people who are really interested in sinners confessing that they're sinful, people interested in evangelistically minded people, as I used to be, don't typically tend to care about systems and structures and power dynamics, right? Because it's all about you and Jesus. It's all about you and God. And so, that is to me one of the harmful things about an evangelistic worldview. And that is something that I lived for many years. And so I look at what I did and the things I was not able to see when I thought about the world that way, right? And okay, so I make these assessments and comments based on my own experiences as well as in the observation of others as they struggle to come to terms with a more fleshed out understanding of how all these things actually play out in people's lives. So I'm gonna move on now. Okay, so that's the intro to sin in the Bible, right? So I asked for definitions, and you all gave me a delightful list. And then I thought, well, let's do two things. Let's look at because I come out of a Christian tradition, and I am engaging both primary testaments of the Christian Bible. We are going to look at Romans, some of the Romans passages again, just to kind of refresh on them, or ones we didn't get to. But also, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the way sin is and is not talked about in the Hebrew Bible. So I do know that the first time we talked about Genesis 3, and maybe even 2 and 3, but definitely Genesis 3. And I pointed out how, I don't have it open right now. In the translations online, you will tend to see headings added to, they're not there in the originals, added to chapters or important passages to help you understand what it is. And most English translations, if they have titles, will talk about Genesis 3 as the first sin, something like that. And that in and of itself just drives me so crazy. Because that is a big piece of why people in a Christian tradition get so hung up on this idea of sin as being disobedience to God. The concept that God is a dictator type of a parent who is telling us what to do or not to do, and somewhat in Genesis 2 and 3, if you're reading it that way, I mean, you're really not paying attention to what the story is doing, and the kind of laughs and the kind of, yeah, and then this happened, and then a snake came along and tried to give them some wisdom and insight. Yeah, it functions well, but I think it has held people back. I think it really has held a lot of people back because it keeps people thinking about themselves in a relationship to the divine that is very punitive. It starts out in negative language, right? To talk about, your relationship to God is messed up because you're a sinner, right? And you have to keep God happy. You really that's really what we're talking about here. You've got to keep God happy. Um, do you have friends that you obey? Like, the people who are the best people in your life, who bring out the best in you, are they people that you relate to in an obedience kind of a way? I hope not. And, that right, like, the kinds of things that people have said about deity or a god, you know, in the ancient world make perfect sense to me. And I think that we need to move beyond it. Um, anyway, let's let's get to some presenting some of this stuff. Let's just do that. All right, let's move over to what was the first one I wanted to look at? Is that it? Let's look at this for a second. Yeah, let's look at this. Okay. So let me see how big, if this is, let's see. Let me try making that bigger. Oh, no, that's not helpful. Shoot. Okay. Well, let me try this. Oh dear. Kind of get from here to there. All right. Well, sorry, folks. You're just going to have to put up with it. Okay. So Genesis 3:1, right? The first sin and its punishment, right? There's a part of me that wishes that I was trying to think, is there a reason or time and place that's a really useful way to talk about what Genesis 3 is doing for children, but then for adults, we shift over to a more adult way of talking about it? I don't know, but I don't, the first sin and its punishment. Well, you get that claim because God said, don't do this in chapter 2, and they do it in chapter 3. So they disobeyed. And, it's a very uncreative, right? It's a very literalistic way of reading it, and not very attentive to literariness, Okay, let's go back over here. So Genesis 4:7, I do want to look at this, but what I think is really fascinating about Genesis 4's reference to sin is that it is talking about it like it's an external power or something external to us. And we do see Paul talking about sin that way in the Newer Testament in some of his writings, when he's talking about how a death can fix sin and conquer sin. And if sin is not just the things you do, but if it's this cosmic power, right? You need something that is stronger or bigger than a cosmic power of evil to take it down. And so you have to talk about Jesus and God and somehow who Jesus is as in his resurrected state or something that's going to be able to take down a power, a cosmic power. And so this is why, let's look at this very quickly. The first Cain murders Abel. Not the first fratricide or homicide, but Cain murders Abel. Okay, so let's look at this briefly. Now, the man knew his woman, Eve, and I'm not going to hold up the signs today, although I do have them here because you all can see them. Right, the English says wife, but I'm going to say woman, right? In English is say, but anyway, so the man knew his woman, Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. There are so many tangents we could take today, aren't there? All right, next she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of fruit from the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. People make a big deal out of this, and I think there's reason and space to do that, about different types of people, agrarian versus nomad, and is this a shift in what God is appreciating because the people themselves are shifting in terms of the way they get their food? And so is this a story about group identity and the struggle between leaving behind what they used to be, and all, there are all kinds of really somewhat productive ways to talk about it. Just have a little throw that out there. But Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions, and ate, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, God had no regard. What a jerk. So Cain was very angry. The vegetarian, right? Cain bringing produce, and Cain got really angry. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen?" There's a part of me that wants to comment on this, right? Like, why I'm angry, and you're being antagonistic by mocking the fact that I'm upset about that. Like, there's this weird dynamic in these stories that just, God is not a lovely, loving being, and it as depicted in these stories. And I think I feel the need to point it out every time I see it, because too many people have been taught to see this as reasonable and are therefore impacted by this way of relating. Anyway, why are you angry? And why is your countenance falling? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. External power, this element of temptation or coming out of nowhere. We're feeling compelled to do something that we maybe know isn't a good idea, but we're struggling to master it, right? If you do well, will you not be accepted? But God literally just had no regard for his offering. And what's wrong with the offering from produce? This story makes no sense to me, right? This story makes me cranky. But I feel like people don't, and I do know that I've heard people preach on this, like this concept of sin lurking at the door and its desires for you. And so this kind of embodiment of sin embodied in some sort of evil thing or whatever. I think it's remarkable that we see it talked about this way. It's part of what I'm getting at in this story. And I don't care about the dating. I know it's several centuries BCE, so that's good enough for me. So another piece of this puzzle, or this picture talking about sin, is the word sin is used so very rarely in the Hebrew Bible. So there's that, right? The word sin doesn't show up in Genesis 2 or 3. The Christian tradition places that many layers of interpretation and reading onto it to come up with a concept of original sin in that story. It's not there. It isn't something that Jewish people have a big deal, are worked up over their sinfulness, right? There's a reason that it's okay for them to do one, they maybe, I don't know if there are weekly prayers like on Shabbat services or something, but there's a reason that they have a day every year to look back over the year and look ahead, and reflect on some shit you did instead of hour by hour monitoring yourself, right? Which is what I did when I was in a different mindset, different state. The other thing that I want to look at with you, and from Genesis at least, is the fact that the next time we see this concept of sin or sinners coming up is in reference to Sodom in Genesis 13, and then again in Genesis 18. So we get into Genesis, we have, I mean, hang on, let me do a little double check here on this. We have the two references to Sodom in 13 and 18. And then Genesis 20. Oh gosh, I'm trying to remember what that story. Oh, right, that's the second pimping out of Sarah by Abraham. Excuse me, this time to the king of Gerar. So I kept you from sinning against me. So that's what, 5 by chapter 20 of Genesis. I've sinned against you. Okay, so we don't. Okay, right. We don't have a whole lot going on here. What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? Okay, so let's go back to this. I want to look at this briefly with you, because the story about Sodom, or Sodom and Gomorrah, and their sinfulness, right, is a well-known one, especially for people who are who watch the work that I create. So the people who might be watching this on my channel tend to be fairly familiar with the story about Sodom. So Abram and Lot separate. So chapter 12 is the first pimping out of Sarah to the Pharaoh by Abraham, and it's done in the context of they've left their homeland. God promises to give them a land, and that the land that's before them, and God promises to curse those who curse Abraham and bless those who bless him. A really fascinating set of promises that I try really hard to get my students to think about. And then there's a famine, and so they have to keep moving. They can't stay in the land where they were promised to be able to settle, so they go down to Egypt, and we have that whole pimping out of Sarah. And because of her, that's what the text even says, the Pharaoh gives Abram lots of gifts, right? So he leaves a rich man, even though he's lied and all kinds of stuff. Sarah doesn't have a single word in the whole story, but it really revolves around her. She's the piece that makes that whole story in Egypt work. And so they leave with all kinds of goods. Okay, so Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his woman and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. So Lot is his nephew. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, which he just acquired in Egypt because Sarah was so good in bed, right? Rich in livestock, in silver and in gold, all of that. He journeyed on by stages from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. So at the beginning, when they were in this part of the world before, according to the storyline, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now, Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not support both of them living together, because their possessions were so great that they could not live together. Not the best story writing. That would be scratched out by an English professor and said, try again. Try to restate this one. Thus, strife arose between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. So many steps we've skipped over here, right? Because Abram and Sarai had left home and had nothing, and now all of a sudden they go to Egypt and they have lots and enough to have herders of the livestock. It's fascinating. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. This was already established in the previous chapter, but we're being reminded that there are people already living there, right? Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. And they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, or Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now, the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. That's it. That's all we get. That's all we know, is they're great sinners against the Lord. In their context, what does that mean? Right? I mean, in their context, at bare minimum, it means that they don't worship this God, right? They don't worship Yahweh. That's all it means. Now, certainly people's creativity or, um, need to fill in the gaps and also need, desire, whatever, to demonize other people and that tends to be done sexually, right? We tend to sexually demonize other people. This is a thing I end up talking about a lot because it's a thing that's very common in the Bible. It's also a thing that's still common. I mean, I don't need to get off on that tangent right now. But so, what does it mean that they were great sinners against the Lord? What does that even mean, right? Does that mean that they're out there worshiping all these other idols but that's really just about worship. That's about not worshiping this God. What does it mean to sin against the Lord? It's about not putting that particular God first, about not worshiping that God, not doing whatever that God requires and asks. And in this context of the writing of the Hebrew Bible and the creating of this identity, for better and for worse, right? That these writings are about producing people who will worship only this God. And it doesn't work, and it doesn't take for several centuries. Like, it's kind of funny, really, if you can step back from it all instead of being overwhelmed by all the judgment, that the people keep doing what they used to do, which is worship all these other gods also. And I don't know why, it just makes me giggle sometimes. So it's important to me, though, that you see that that's it. That's all we get about Sodom. All right, let's keep reading. Make sure I haven't forgotten about something else. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward, for all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever." It's big, wide range. "I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. We don't get a reference to sinfulness or being a sinner or a great sinner again until chapter 18, when you have the little showdown between Lot, right? Lot and Abram. Lot and the Lord over the town of Sodom. So it's important to me to note the lack of discussion of sinfulness here, okay? That's what I'm going for on this one. Let me come over here and see if there I'm glad to see. Thank you all for some sweet comments, some thoughtful or appreciative comments. I am not sure if there are any specific questions. I don't see any that were yeah, I'm glad that you're getting some love here, Kip. If you're still here. So, question, do Jewish traditions put as much blame on Eve as Christian traditions do? No, they do not. No, they do not. And nor do they have the same focus on sinfulness in general that Christians do. And that's because Paul is the one who reads on to Genesis 2 and 3, all this sinfulness stuff. It's not a Jewish hang-up. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to make, which I thought I just added that to the show. Oops, as a Jew, I agree. That's nice. This is the one I meant to put up first. A lot of Jews are really good at interpretation so that they can ditch the bad stuff and keep the good stuff. That is, and the next comment, as a Jew, I agree. I mean, I think that, no, I'm not denying that. I'm also just thinking, well, I want to be careful with that too, because that's what Christians tend to do. Without realizing it, sometimes they are holding on to some of the harmful ideas, but many Christians are just like, God is love and love and love, 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 right? And so they aren't aware of all the bad stuff. So a lot of people of faith actually do try to navigate their own texts and to focus on the good and the loving. It's, yeah, when these other pieces come into play where Anyway, okay. So I think that that's true what you've said, but I also think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I've had plenty of Jewish students who haven't, part of what I'm trying to get at, I've had plenty of students who currently practicing and formerly who hadn't had a critical assessment of the way they read their own scriptures either, just in the same way that a lot of my Christian students hadn't, right? So I want to be thoughtful about that because that's an important thing to me as well. I don't know if that made sense, but I didn't mean to leave that up there. Sorry. Okay. So what I want to do now, let's look at, there are a couple others I want to share and we'll look at together, because when it comes to the laws in Leviticus, right? So the book of Leviticus is about the priestly things, right? And what the priests need to do to stay pure and holy, but also all the different things about burnt offerings and getting yourself right with God in various ways. So what is interesting to me is there's no reference to sin here, right? When you bring speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any of you bring an offering of livestock to the Lord, you shall bring your offering from the herd or from the flock. Bringing an offering, right? The priest shall turn the rest, the depiction of what happens here is something I also try to get people to pay attention to, right? The bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So at the entrance of the place you're going to gather, somebody has just splattered a whole bunch of blood all over the thing sitting right there. Like, have you thought that through? Have you thought about what that's going to do? And after a few days, what that's going to be like? I don't know how often they washed that down, The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into its parts. Sons of the priest Aaron shall put fire on the altar and arrange the parts with the head, all the things. But some you're going to wash with water, then the priest shall turn the rest into smoke on the altar as a burnt offering. So the smoke of cooking the meat is a way that you're offering it to God. I mean, it's a clever way to think of it, right? Olah, like the burning, burning up of things as a gift. That's how it makes its way to God in the smoke. And an offering of fire by pleasing odor to the Lord, that God enjoys the scent of a barbecue, right? That's what we're talking about. We're keeping God happy, right? But here we're not, if I do a little search for, right, sin, there's nothing. There's nothing on this page. Pleasing odor, that's it, not sin. We're not talking about sin here. When we're talking about grain offerings, same thing, right? We're not talking about sin. We have a pleasing odor to the Lord, pleasing odor. The things smell good. You're keeping God happy. Like baking makes a lot of people happy because the scent smells really good. So off a sacrifice of well-being. This isn't about sinfulness. This is something else, right? Pleasing odors, right? Leviticus 4, purification offerings. Okay, now we're getting into something that's referencing sin, right? The Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelites saying, when anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done and does any one of them. Right. If it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people. I'm sure that many of you have read this, but it's a fascinating thing to think about, like the implications of all these claims, right? Bringing guilt on the people. The leader, if the leader steps out of, missteps, then the whole people are held accountable to or are affected by it. That's a really interesting idea, isn't it? Just going to leave that alone for now. He shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull of the herd as a purification offering to the Lord. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot for a priest, an anointed priest. Okay, sure, they're special, whatever. We could talk also about the material part of this, the economic part of this, and, you know, the priests didn't have their own flocks, right? So, you know, where's a priest gonna get a bull to offer? The priests tended to eat based on what other people brought and offered, right? Um, so how does a priest get an entire bull to slaughter because he's, do you know what I'm saying? It's kind of an interesting thing that I never stopped to think about until a few years ago when someone, asked me to think about these things. So, the anointed priest shall take some of the blood of the bull and bring it to the tent of meeting. The priest shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain. The priest shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar of fragrant incense that is in the tent, and the rest of the blood of the bull he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering. So there's no getting around the role of the blood of cows, as someone said in the first part, talking about what is sin. Yeah, there's no getting around that, right? The blood of bovine, if you will. Um, but why, And I hear a lot of people who've been raised in Christian traditions talking about it's giving up something really important to yourself as a sacrifice. I think that's a I think that's a moralizing way of looking at it. I think originally it had more to do with some form of accountability for priests or the people. It also had to do with eating, survival, and it had to do with their belief in keeping that the gods needed to be kept happy. I mean, I really think that's primarily what's going on here, and that's why the language about the pleasing odor to the Lord, like, that's in here over and over, right? Pleasing odor. Oh, it's just once here, but, um, so I guess there's a if any one of the ordinary people among you sins unintentionally, let me close this out here. Right, and ordinary people sins unintentionally in doing any one of the things that by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done and incurs guilt. When the sin that you committed is made known to you, you shall bring a female goat without blemish as your offering for the sin that you have committed. You shall lay your hand on the head of the purification offering. Purification offering shall be slaughtered at the place of the burnt offering. The priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and put it on the horns of the altar. You should pour out the rest of it at the base of the altar. All these things, right? Turn it into smoke on the altar for a pleasing odor to the Lord. Thus the priest shall make atonement on your behalf, and you shall be forgiven. So the idea of sinning, right? This is the closest we come that I know of in the Hebrew Bible to anything defining what it means. And so it's all about the commands. And so, okay, well, let me back out of here. So maybe it's not just about keeping commands and being obedient to God, because if you look at the heart of what all those commands are, which is what some people want to do, and make sure that we talk about, like, it can be summed up in worshiping, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbors yourself. I'm like, well, there's a lot beyond that we're we're skipping over here. Is that in there? Is that a helpful thing for people? It is in there, and I think that is a helpful thing for people to think about. How are we taking care of each other? I think that's a very productive way to look at things. But I get nervous when we try to sweetly succinctly summarize to the point that we're missing some of the bite of what was actually being talked about and the way it was thought of. And in particular, as I've said several times today, the way the human-God relationship is talked about. So even when we get to the Newer Testament and we get to the letters of Paul, the content on sin and salvation in the letters of Paul is very heavily based upon God is a human-like being who has been offended by our actions. God is offended by our actions. We have offended God. And that is just very petty in my mind. that seems rather uninteresting, or it just falls short of helping motivate me. In a system where I was afraid of that God, or I did fear that God, it worked very well, keeping me in line. But as plenty of research has shown us, people who behave based out of fear do not have safe or loving, healthy relationships. That is not fear-based obedience is not, I mean, obedience, right? That, I mean, is obedience. Fear-based obedience in particular, does not lead to the most the an optimal setting for thriving of human beings. So that even, even the salvation, the models of salvation, as Paul engages them in his writings, and Paul and his buddies engage in, are still all based on this central need for a death, because that's what Paul does. He takes Jesus's life and execution. Paul takes Jesus' execution and turns it into something, right? I've been asked this a lot in a lot of different ways lately, and so I'm sorry if I am repeating myself a bit much here, but every single time I start to think about early Christianity and what it is that got things rolling, that got this new sect of Judaism rolling, that then became a separate religion called Christianity. I mean, I get really wound up when I think about it, because I don't know what Paul's intentions were, but I know the effect of it 2,000 years later is predominantly negative. It's an understatement. So I just struggle with all of it. Okay, just pick something productive and go talk about it. Okay, so let's do that. So I had Leviticus things. So now let's just do one more briefly here. And this is random. I'm gonna see what this does. Let's go look at this. Let's just see what this says. Okay. Where does it say sin here? Oh gosh. So this is fascinating to me. This is so fascinating to me. Yeah. There's so many ideas in here that I just want to sit down and like debunk or take apart, like everyone who believes. So this is the letter of 1 John, chapter 5. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ, is the Messiah, has been born of God. There's a reason why this is called John. It sounds very similar to the language in the Gospel of John, even if it's not the same guy writing. So, and everyone who loves the parent loves the child. By this we know. It's been a very long time since I looked at the Greek of this, by the way. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. I'm going to say it again. The way that the Christian tradition has been defined, set up, and perpetuated creates people who are children of God, not adults of God. And I find that quite detrimental to people's well-being, right? When you are constantly, perpetually being told to see yourself in relation to the power of the universe in an obedient kind of a way. I think after a certain stage in our development as humans, we need to get beyond living in that kind of a way. So I don't find it helpful that we talk about God and loving God in this obedience framework. For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments. His commandments are not burdensome, for whatever is born of God conquers the world. Can we talk about that? Like conquering the world? Really? What is that besides colonialism? I mean, really? And this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. Thank you very much, because that makes going off to other lands and telling them about Jesus that much easier to justify. You know what I'm saying? Who is it who conquers the world but the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? I mean, I think there's a reason I haven't read this stuff in a while. And this is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water only water of baptism, perhaps, but with the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the one that testifies, for the Spirit is the truth. I mean, the blood. There's a book on my bookshelf, I think, back here, which I couldn't help but purchase when it first came out, and I have not read much of any of it, called Blood, A Critique of Christianity. Wondering if anyone here has read this. Is anyone? I'm gonna stop sharing so you can see what I'm talking about. Has anyone here read this? It got a decent amount of traction in certain circles, at least academic circles, when it first came out. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to go back to this really quickly, and I think I'm going to wrap up here for today. Whoops. Let's do this and present. Just curious note. Yeah, academic fields, academic circles engage this. It's pretty thick. It's a pretty long book, relatively speaking. Small print, which means, yeah, it's dense. It's a dense read. Let's see. Lots of notes on this one. Wow, I'd forgotten about that. It's more than half. It's almost half notes. 258 pages, but then another 150 of notes. That's a lot of notes. But I want to show you what the contents of this book. The introduction, red mythology. Part 1, the vampire state, and part 2, hematologies. So blood ologies, right? Part 1, the vampire state. Nation, in parentheses, Jesus' kin. State, chapter 2, state, the vampire state. Chapter 3, capital, Christians and money. Part 2, hematologies. Chapter 4, Odysseus' blood. Chapter 5, bleeding and melancholia. Chapter 6, Leviathan and the blood pump. And then the conclusion is on the Christian question, parenthetically, Jesus and monotheism. Yeah, I just, when I'm feeling my best, I will try to point out to my students that what Paul creates is a thanaphilic religion, right? It requires a death. Thanatos is death. Philic, the love of, right? And so what Paul puts, somewhat drawing upon the animal sacrificial system, right, in the Hebrew Bible, but the ideas in terms of how he applies them go way beyond that. And they look much more like most of the Greek and Roman religious traditions and others, Persian and other religious traditions around him, to make sense of salvation in response to this category or this issue called sin that humans allegedly need help addressing. So it requires a death. And then part of that is the blood, right? It's much stronger in the Hebrew Bible, I would say, than in Newer Testament ideas, but it's still in there in the Newer Testament. And Nothing But the Blood of Jesus, right, is a song that I've sung more than once in my life. Okay. Let's finish looking at, I did want to look at this passage in 1 John, and then we'll, so I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life. You may believe in the name of the Son of God. Okay. And this is the boldness we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have obtained the requests made of him. If you see your brother or sister committing what is not a deadly sin, which is what, right? You will ask, and God will give life to such one, to those whose sin is not deadly. There is a sin that is deadly. I do not say that you should pray about that. There's a sin that is deadly. I do not say that you should pray about that. I don't even know what to make of that, right? All wrongdoing is sin, but there is sin that is not deadly, right? We know that those who are born of God do not sin. How is that possible? But the one who is born of God protects them, and the evil one does not touch them. So this whole, the whole embodiment of evil is out to get us is just, it drives me crazy, right? I mean, it just drives me crazy. It's taken on fascinating lives of its own over the centuries, but the lack of accountability that it creates, it just okay. But the one who's born of God protects them, and the evil one does not touch them. We know that we are God's children and that the whole world lies under the power of the evil one. Now, that is a fascinating claim to make, especially at the end of a letter. And we know that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true, in his Son, Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life. Little children. I mean, that is so patronizing. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. I just need to see. It probably is. What would that be? Tech? No. Let's do another parallel here. And then we're going to go do all. Let's see. Let's get down here to Greek really quickly. French, koine. What is that? Little children, techna. Yeah, technia. Children. Phylloxeta, healta, autoton, eidolon. Phylloxeta, do not imprison yourself from. Okay, I'd have to look that up, but that's phylake is. Anyway, let's not just keep yourselves from idols. That's a much stronger. Oh, I need to go look at that word. Anyway, little children. He is closing the letter, calling them little children. Can we just talk about that for a minute? Closing a letter, referring to calling these people little children. Okay. So these are all intertwined, right? The obedience issue, the talking about God as someone to fear. We need to obey this God. All the obedience language in general is so very childlike. It is so very childlike. We think you need these these things in place to keep you properly behaved. And when it is externally motivated, it is not necessarily internalized in genuine ways, right? And so closing that out by calling them children, I just can't. Yes, you are children of God. You are permanently children of God. Okay. I hope there was something helpful. I think I'm enjoying the fact that there are people chatting here and that there are people here watching who were able to be here, wanted to be here live. I hope that people watching this later will find something useful in it as well. I'll be a little bit more organized for the third one. I just knew that there were a lot of things we could discuss here. So we'll do another on sin. I guess we can do it next week because 2 weeks from today, I do have Erin Runyon's coming and it's on to have a conversation, and I'm really excited about that. She is someone I admire very much, actually, as a scholar and as a human being. And I wish there were more people like her in the world. And I'm delighted that she's going to be able to come and have a conversation with us in 2 weeks. So next week we'll do part 3 of talking about sin. So thanks for being here. Those of you who were able to be, wanted to be, thank you for all the ways that you support the work I'm doing. I am grateful to you all for that. And I will see you next week.